Do you know which shadowy figure from the past eluded justice in the late 19th century, leaving behind a trail of heinous unsolved crimes that captivated the world for over a century? In this video, we will take you on a terrifying journey into the sinister world of Jack the Ripper, a ruthless and enigmatic killer who preyed upon the women of London's impoverished Whitechapel district, leaving an indelible mark on the history of crime. But before we do that, welcome to Night Ales, the history channel that tells the story of the least explored part of history. Chapter 1. A background of the Whitechapel district. In order to fully comprehend the chilling saga of Jack the Ripper, it is crucial to first understand the backdrop against which his gruesome crimes unfolded. The Whitechapel district of London, located in the East End, served as the hunting ground for this notorious killer. A densely populated area, Whitechapel was characterised by its narrow winding streets, dark alleys and dilapidated buildings. In the late 19th century, the district was synonymous with poverty, overcrowding and rampant crime. During the Victorian era, Whitechapel had become a haven for immigrants, particularly those fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. By the 1880s, the district was home to nearly 76,000 residents, many of whom lived in abject poverty. The area was rife with social issues, including alcoholism, unemployment, and poor sanitation. Such conditions bred a sense of despair and hopelessness among the inhabitants, making it a fertile environment for crime to thrive. In fact, between 1886 and 1889, the crime rate in Whitechapel had increased by an alarming 62%. Amidst this bleak landscape, the women who would become the victims of Jack the Ripper struggled to survive. Most of his victims were prostitutes who resorted to selling their bodies to make ends meet in the unforgiving climate of the East End. These women, often suffering from alcohol addiction and living in squalid conditions, were particularly vulnerable to violence. Hence the anonymity of Whitechapel's dark streets and the desperation of its residents made it an ideal hunting ground for a calculating predator like Jack the Ripper. Chapter 2. The Canonical Murders. Mary Ann Nichols, August 31st, 1888. With the bleak and treacherous landscape of Whitechapel as our backdrop, we now turn our attention to the first of the canonical 5 murders, that of Mary Ann Nichols. As we shed light on the gruesome details of her demise, it becomes clear that this was no ordinary act of violence, but rather a chilling example of the diabolical nature of Jack the Ripper's crimes. Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old woman with a troubled past marked by alcoholism and estrangement from her family, met her brutal end on the 31st of August, 1888. On that fateful night, she was last seen alive on the corner of Whitechapel Road and Osborne Street at around 2:30 a.m. Merely an hour later, her mutilated body was discovered by a carman named Charles Cross in Bucks Row, a narrow and dark alleyway in Whitechapel. The crime scene bore witness to the sheer brutality of the killer. Nichols's throat had been savagely slashed twice, nearly severing her head from her body, and her abdomen was brutally mutilated with several deep incisions. These injuries not only indicated the killer's violent tendencies, but also hinted at a level of surgical precision, which would become a chilling hallmark of Jack the Ripper's modus operandi. The gruesome nature of Mary Ann Nichols' murder sent shockwaves through the Whitechapel community, as the viciousness and apparent skill of the killer suggested a new breed of criminal had emerged. Little did the residents of the East End know that this was only the beginning of a horrifying series of murders that would hold them in the grip of terror for months to come. Annie Chapman, September 8th, 1888. As the horrid news of Mary Ann Nichols' murder reverberated through the streets of Whitechapel, the community was left reeling, unaware that the sinister spectre of Jack the Ripper was far from finished. It was only a week later, on September 8th, 1888, that he would strike again, claiming the life of his second canonical victim, Annie Chapman. Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old woman who, like Nichols, struggled with alcoholism and had a tumultuous personal life, was last seen alive at approximately 5:30 a.m. on the morning of her murder. She was observed talking to a man outside of 29 Hanbury Street, a short distance from the infamous Spitalfields Market. Mere minutes later, her mutilated body was discovered in the backyard of the same address by a resident, John Davis. This murder presented a horrific tableau that demonstrated the killer's continued escalation in brutality. Chapman's throat had been deeply slashed, much like Nichols's, but the extent of the additional injuries were even more gruesome. Her abdomen had been cut open, and several of her internal organs had been removed, including her uterus. The killer had also taken the time to arrange some of her possessions around her body, adding a macabre element of staging to the gruesome scene. The community of Whitechapel thus found itself in the grip of a diabolical killer whose methods were becoming increasingly more savage and disturbing. Elizabeth Stride, September 30, 1888. The terror that gripped Whitechapel showed no signs of abating, as the relentless killer known as Jack the Ripper continued to prey on the vulnerable women of the East End. On the night of September 30th, 1888, the Ripper would strike twice, in what would come to be known as the double event. The first of these heinous acts was the murder of Elizabeth Stride, the third canonical victim. A 44-year-old Swedish native, Elizabeth Stride, had a troubled history characterized by violent relationships and alcoholism issues. She was last spotted on Berners Street that tragic night with a man at about 12:45 in the morning. A cart driver named Louis Diemschutz found her lifeless body in the nearby Dutfields yard at around 1 in the morning. The crime scene, while gruesome, presented a stark contrast to the previous two murders. Stride's throat had been deeply slashed, severing her left carotid artery. However, her body showed no signs of the abdominal mutilations that had characterized the murders of Nichols and Chapman. This has led some to speculate that the Ripper was interrupted in the act, forcing him to flee the scene before he could complete his sadistic ritual. Despite the lack of mutilation, the circumstances surrounding Stride's murder were undeniably diabolical. The killer had struck quickly and silently, leaving the victim no chance to cry out for help or defend herself. Additionally, the choice of a dark, secluded location demonstrated the Ripper's cunning and familiarity with the shadowy corners of Whitechapel. The fact that the murderer felt emboldened enough to strike again within hours of Stride's death further underscores the chilling audacity and insatiable bloodlust of this infamous killer. Catherine Eddowes, September 30, 1888. Merely an hour after the murder of Elizabeth Stride, the Ripper claimed his fourth canonical victim, Catherine Eddowes, in a gruesome display of depravity. On September 30, 1888, at about 1 a.m., a woman named Catherine Eddowes was 46 years old, was released from a neighborhood police station after being detained earlier that day for public intoxication. Tragically, her independence would only last a short while, since she would soon come into contact with the Ripper. Her dismembered body was discovered in Mitre Square at around 1:45 a.m., just 12 steps from the scene of Stride's murder. Once again, the murder scene displayed blatant signs of the work of the Ripper. Eddowes' throat had been deeply slashed, and her body subjected to the same horrific mutilations seen in previous murders. Her abdomen had been savagely ripped open, and her intestines had been thrown over her right shoulder. The killer had also taken trophies, removing her left kidney and part of her uterus. The sheer brutality of the murder, coupled with the killer's chilling ability to strike again in such a short period, sent shockwaves through the Whitechapel community once again. The diabolical murder of Catherine Eddowes served as a horrifying reminder of the Ripper's unrelenting sadism and his chilling ability to evade capture. As the investigation continued, The desperate search for answers only intensified in the face of such unimaginable evil. Mary Jane Kelly, November 9, 1888. Just when the people of Whitechapel thought the terror might have subsided, the Ripper struck again with his most gruesome and diabolical murder yet. On November 9, 1888, the life of Mary Jane Kelly, a 25-year-old woman, would come to a horrific end, making the fifth and final canonical victim of the elusive killer. Kelly's body was discovered in her room at 13 Miller's Court, where the Ripper had subjected her to an unspeakable level of brutality. The crime scene was a nightmarish tableau. Kelly's throat had been slashed down to the spine, her abdomen eviscerated, and her organs scattered around the room. Her heart had been removed, and her face was so brutally mutilated that she was almost unrecognizable. Chapter 3: The Investigation. The investigation into the gruesome Whitechapel murders is just as interesting as were the diabolical murders themselves. The Metropolitan Police, led by Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, scrambled to bring the elusive killer to justice. But despite the tireless efforts of seasoned investigators, the diabolical murderer known as Jack the Ripper managed to remain unsuspected, leaving behind a trail of baffling clues and unanswered questions. Key investigators included Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, who led the on-the-ground efforts, and Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who oversaw the overall investigation from Scotland Yard. Employing cutting-edge techniques of the time, such as door-to-door inquiries, newspaper appeals, and even bloodhounds, the police were relentless in their pursuit of the Ripper. Over the course of the investigation, numerous theories and suspects were considered, ranging from local butchers and surgeons to the more outlandish suggestions of a gentleman killer from high society. Some of the most notable suspects included Montague Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher, and Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant with a history of mental illness. Despite the extensive efforts of the investigators, no suspect was ever conclusively identified or apprehended. All in all, the inability to solve the Whitechapel murders only fueled the public's fascination and horror, as the Ripper's true identity remained a chilling enigma, leaving a haunting legacy that continues to captivate and terrify generations. That's all we have today at Night Tales. If you found this video interesting, leave your thoughts in the comments about this chilling part of history, and don't forget to subscribe.